Welcome everyone to Cantus Firmus at the Movies. I am your host, Cody Cook is my last name. And I have with me two guests, which is pretty exciting because I've only done one so far, but the original idea was to do a panel type thing. So this was actually the first, this was the idea for the first one I wanted to do. And then we did some scheduling things, ended up making it the fifth one, I believe. So
Excellent.
You're discussing Batman versus Superman. And I'm discussing it with my friends Ben Doublett and Jackson Ferrell. I mentioned them in that order because that's the alphabetical order, and that seems fair.
Also the order of precedence.
It's true.
So Ben is actually my first atheist guest, which is really exciting because I've been trying to get atheists on. And I have some more in the works, hopefully. But atheists are real flighty. I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
well,
They have very busy schedules.
Yeah, and depending upon how you treat me, obviously, will determine whether or not others want to join as well.
Yeah. Well, I know that you got to get up early in the morning, curse the divine,
Right?
have your morning coffee.
Yeah.
So
Lots of babies to eat.
it's babies to eat. And so Ben actually, if you've listened to the podcast before, you may have heard the debate that I did with him on who had a better moral philosophy, Jesus or Ayn Rand. He chose Ayn Rand in that, and Ayn Rand is and Ben and Ayn Rand were both. Ayn Rand was an atheist, and Ben is an atheist. And Ben is still fairly influenced by Ayn Rand's philosophy, as I understand.
Yes, absolutely.
And a very kind of free market and individualistic kind of ethical approach. Ben also is a novelist. He wrote a novella called Kung Fu Gladiator, which is available on Amazon and paperback and Kindle. And he is currently, I believe the term is querying agents.
That is the correct term, yes.
For another novel that he's written that I read an earlier version of called Captain Magnificent, filibuster.
The colon is very important.
Yeah. So it's not Captain Magnificent Filibuster. It's not a magnificent filibuster. And the colon is the two dots. It's not a colon cleanse or something. And so that's Ben, and we have Jackson as well, who's made a couple little appearances on my podcast proper. They're not on Cantus Firmus at the Movies. And one of the things he's working on, which I think is pretty cool and I follow, is called Chocolate Book. And you can find that at chocolatebook.net. Is that correct, Jackson?
Yeah. Should we tell them what it is, or should we just leave them in the dark so as to build suspense?
No, I was going to tell them, or you can tell them. Since you could probably
okay.
Better words.
Chocolate Book is basically this thing that I've been doing every weekday for a little over a year and change, where I eat some chocolate and read the Bible and photograph it and type up some words about what I read. I usually read a chapter every day or so, and I am currently in the middle of a series I call All the Paul, which is exactly what it says on the tin. I'm reading everything Paul wrote.
That's great. So that's awesome. So the normal approach we do after I introduce everybody is to give a very spoilery plot outline. So I'm going to let everybody know now that that's going to happen. But I actually thought it might be worth noting that Adam West, who played Batman in the TV series, has recently passed away. And obviously, if you're a Batman fan, you probably appreciated that series as well. And so I'm not very good at eulogies, but whatever you're supposed to say when someone passes away that you respect or have an appreciation for would be appropriate to say at this point.
Yeah. It was very sad.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I had a feeling there would be some talking over each other with the three people on it, but go ahead.
I was just going to say I believe there's a new animated movie out that featured Adam West's voice.
I think they were doing Batman. Two. I know one was out. Is the second one already out?
I don't know about another one.
Yeah, for the Batman 66 type thing. Yeah, which I actually have heard is good, but I haven't had a chance to see it yet. Yeah. But yeah. So anyway, that's sad.
Yeah. The Adam West Batman was actually my first introduction to Batman, and I didn't really realize at the time that it was supposed to be a comedy, because it was 6.
I've heard a lot of people who watched it as kids say that. They just thought it was just an action show. They didn't get the humor.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to go back and watch some of that and see it from a different, older, more mature angle.
Similarly, when I read Ayn Rand as a child, I thought it was just dull, but it turns out it was a satire. It was hilarious.
Yeah, that's a reaction a lot of people have.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll give you. I've got some notes here and just kind of plot outline. By the way, does anybody remember? Did they say the name of the country where that slaughter happens in that Superman's blamed for? I know, like Cordo Maltese is like a name that shows up in the comics, but I don't know if they ever say.
I believe they did. Nairobi, I think.
Is it Nairobi?
Yeah.
No, it was Nairobi.
Nairobi?
Because they made it up for the
Yeah.
know, because they couldn't pick an actual country in Africa.
Okay, I was going to say Kahndaq if I couldn't think of anything. That's where Black Adam's from.
Well, interestingly, I also did that in my book, in Captain Magnificent Filibuster. There is another made-up country called Bhutan, very similar to North Korea.
Yeah.
Where the hero visits.
And if you can tell anything, the quality of something by the fact that they make up the place names, then this book will be at least as good as Batman versus Superman.
Clearly, yeah.
Like, I guess I'm gonna have to make up a country in chocolate book now.
Apparently, yeah.
All right, so I'll go through the plot here, and there's so much that kind of happens here, and I tried to be kind of simple, but it'll take just a minute to read my thing here. So. We learn through a flashback that Bruce Wayne was personally present during Superman's fight with Zod. I didn't realize I didn't have an L there. In Man of Steel, which is the movie that came before this one. And Bruce Wayne essentially blames Superman for all the loss of life that took place that Man of Steel didn't really show, but that you knew darn well was happening. We then move forward to an interview that Lois Lane is conducting with a rebel group in... Was it Nairobi?
Nairobi. Yeah.
Nairobi. Okay. So she's conducting this interview with this rebel group, I guess the leader of this rebel group, and violence breaks out. Superman arrives to save Lois, but is ultimately blamed for all of this violence that happens. And there seems to be something kind of nefarious that's going on.
One thing I didn't understand in that point.
Yeah.
When he smashes the general into the wall, does the general get turned into some kind of smushy, bloody pulp? Or is he somehow alive at the end of that?
I presume that he's dead, but I think they would probably make the argument that it was, I guess that was maybe necessary. I guess because Lois was going to be killed.
I feel like it would have been very easy for Superman to turn mid smashing into the wall.
Yeah.
So that his back is against the wall.
It's also it's also possible that Superman used his head.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. These are the kind of conversations that you have when everybody reads comics or follows that kind of stuff. So, and I will say out front, I don't want, if you're not a comics fan, I hopefully will try not to get too mired in all these little details of things that we know from the comics, but we all are, somewhat familiar with these backstories.
Yeah. Well, I think the tricky thing about it is that given the sort of Superman that we're looking at, for indeed there are different sorts of Supermans, it isn't so clear cut, whether or not the general lived or died.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that would certainly, it comes a political, I guess you'd assume that he's not dead, because then you think they would have went to all this plot line of the political ramifications of Superman killing the leader of a rebel group in Nairobi. So in any case, we move forward, and we discover that Lex Luthor has discovered a piece of kryptonite, and he is trying to sell it to the United States government to weaponize it in case they need to use it against Superman. And all he wants in exchange is access to General Zod's ship and his body. And Zod, for those who didn't see Man of Steel, is the Kryptonian criminal who Superman fights and kills in Man of Steel. We then kind of moving forward a little bit more. Bruce Wayne has this dream/vision of a future where Superman has become a tyrant, and Batman helps lead a rebellion against him. At the end of that, Flash sort of like shows up apparently in real life, I guess, and this little time portal, and warns Batman about Superman. But you might not have known he was Flash because he doesn't really look like Flash, but that is Flash. So then Lois discovers that the bullets fired during the slaughter in Nairobi actually came from LexCorp, and they were this whole thing happened in Nairobi to set up Superman, make him look bad. And it does, in fact, spark a Senate hearing where Superman is supposed to be answering all these questions, and Luthor sets off a bomb in the courtroom, which kills everyone in the room and makes Superman look guilty. Let's see here. Luthor then uses this information database from the ship, and as well as Zod's body and his own blood, to begin creating the weaponized life form Doomsday, who is part Kryptonian and part made of Luthor's DNA. He then allows Batman to find the kryptonite and kidnap Superman's mother, saying he will kill her if Batman isn't dead in an hour. Batman tries to kill Superman, who seeks to convince Batman to help him find his mother, Martha. This triggers a catharsis in Batman, who suddenly understands Superman's humanity, partly because his mother is also named, or was also named, Martha. So Batman agrees to help Superman save his mother. They rescue her, but Lex then unleashes Doomsday. Wonder Woman joins Batman and Superman in fighting him. Superman manages to kill Doomsday with a kryptonite spear that Batman had developed, but in doing so, he dies himself. Lex Luthor then communicates with who appears to be Steppenwolf, one of Darkseid's generals from the planet Apocalypse. This, I think, hopefully will make more sense in the next Justice League movie, if you're not following it here. But sort of these characters that exist in the comics. Then Lex is arrested, and Batman visits him in prison. Decides not to brand him, and the brand is kind of important because Batman will brand certain criminals that he catches with the bat signal or symbol, and he'll heat it up and burn them on their skin, and that apparently communicates to everybody in prison that this guy was a serious, low-life sexual degenerate who tortured or molested women or children or whatever. And so Batman was thinking, I guess, apparently going to brand him, and decides not to, and he's apparently changed in some way because of Superman's example. And Luthor then sort of babbles on, foreshadowing the coming of Darkseid, that it's coming soon. So that is basically what happens in the movie.
Yeah.
Right?
That's about right. Yep.
Okay. So what did everybody think of the movie just from a film goer's viewpoint and a comic enthusiast viewpoint?
So for me, visually, the film was amazing. It was one of the best looking superhero films I've ever seen. The action scenes were brilliant. Story-wise, there were a lot of plot holes. There was a lot of stuff going on that didn't necessarily make sense and that was very unclear.
Did you see the Ultimate Edition or the cut version?
I've seen both.
Okay.
The Ultimate Edition did clear a few things up, but there were a lot of things missing, like how and who knew this. That was one thing that really did not get clearly communicated to the audience.
Well, it seems that Luthor does.
Luthor apparently knows everyone's, but we're never really shown how.
Well, he has that database on the
or
the supers or whatever, the Wonder Woman and metahumans.
Yeah.
And he does say something. What does he say at the end of the thing when he's talking to Batman in prison?
At the end of
Wayne
very
Manor,
last
and a
scene,
twisted kind
it's
of
revealed that Luthor knew that Bruce Wayne was Batman the entire time.
Yeah.
Even though he doesn't use that knowledge at any point.
Well, he does use it though.
He
invites Wayne to the party to meet Clark Kent.
Yeah.
And to give him access to the servers.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
And Superman seems to discover at some point that well, actually, we are shown the point when Superman discovers that Bruce Wayne is Batman, and that's in the scene where where Bruce Wayne is investigating Lex Luthor's mansion.
Yeah, the benefit part.
Yeah, the benefit, mm-hmm. And he hears Bruce Wayne communicating with Alfred over the radio
with a super hearing.
Yeah. But nothing that they say in that conversation gives away the fact that Bruce Wayne is Batman. Even though in the immediate aftermath, Clark Kent, Superman in his guise as Clark Kent, confronts Bruce Wayne and has learned somehow that he is in fact Batman.
I think you may get an indication at the party that he's Batman.
Yeah.
But I can't remember exactly what is said on over.
At the party, he demands to know Bruce Wayne's opinion of.
Well, I'm trying to think of what Alfred says to Bruce that Superman would have heard that could have suggested that he was Batman. If there was anything, I remember at the time feeling like Superman had a hint that something was going on there.
Yeah, it was all.
But also, unless Batman's cowl is lined in lead, Superman obviously knows who Batman is.
Well, at that point, he had not seen him in person yet.
Yeah.
Like they hadn't had that confrontation where Bruce Wayne's or where the Batmobile bounces off of Superman.
Yeah.
Which, as another point, a side point, would not have happened because even though Superman is super strong, unless he weighs more than the Batmobile, when the Batmobile and Superman collide, no matter how strong Superman is, he's going to be the one who flies off in the opposite direction, not the Batmobile.
Okay, well, I didn't realize that I had invited Neil deGrasse Tyson.
I'm sorry. That's an important point to make.
I think so too. I mean, too often physics gets thrown out the window.
Can Superman control his density?
Apparently.
I mean, they've done that. There's done those things like if you stand a certain way, people have a hard time lifting you up. Like you have a seeming greater weight than you do or something.
I think if Superman were braced against the ground in such a way as to use the weight of some other object to add to his own, then the Batmobile could have bounced off of him.
Yeah.
But the way he was standing upright with hands on his hips.
Yeah, and he doesn't have the spidey grippy things.
Yeah,
so
and that's an important point to point out because I am something of a pedant.
What if I don't know. I mean, if he sort of pushed himself forward a little.
He was standing completely still.
Yeah. Well, we know that Superman can fly. And so this implies some ability to, if he were about to be sent flying by a collision with the Batmobile, I would think that he could immediately arrest his flight through the air, with whatever period of time constitutes Superman's reaction time, which is very, very short,
Maybe Superman has telekinetic power, but only over his own body.
Oh, is that so?
Maybe that's it.
Yeah,
that seems to be the way that it works.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
Okay. So, talking about the style being, liking the style of it. I mean, it definitely feels like a Zack Snyder film. Who directed it? Who, I can take or leave sometimes, but in this case, I really liked the movie. I mean, there are certain plot things that I think are a little bit confusing. I think particularly if you don't know a lot about the comics, like you're not going to understand what's going on in Flash and things like that.
There was an awful lot of stuff in there. Probably a good half hour, 45 minutes of screen time that was completely irrelevant to the plot. That was only in there to set up the future DCEU, their extended cinematic universe, which is understandable in the larger context because they're trying desperately to catch up to Marvel, who did this way better. But it makes for a bit of a less impactful movie.
I wouldn't say that there was any more than 10 minutes of stuff that set up for the other movies. I mean, they discover I don't know. Maybe if you think about it, I don't know. He gets access to Lexus servers and discovers these other superheroes. But there's another point. There's another reason why he gets access to the server too, which is to figure out what's going on with the ship and the kryptonite shipment coming in. Yeah,
I think all the footage that we see of the Flash and of Cyborg and his long dream sequence where he's in a sort of future dystopia ruled by Superman. The sequence where Flash pops in out of a wormhole. That's all unnecessary to the plot. Possibly, and I don't want to say, and I could be persuaded otherwise on this point, but possibly the entire presence of Wonder Woman was unnecessary, other than to make the fight scene at the end a bit more exciting.
Well, I think, I guess she is there to sort of set up what could happen in the future as well. I mean, they are definitely doing some setup for the Justice League. Yeah. But I don't necessarily mind that. I mean, I understand that there's a world that's here that's kind of opening up, and I think that I kind of thought that was sort of cool, and I don't think it was too distracting. But I will say one thing about Wonder Woman: why is it that it is at this precise point that Wonder Woman decides to come out of hiding?
Yeah,
because we know that Man of Steel happened, and she didn't do anything about Zod.
I actually had that same thought. The one thing I would say in their defense is we see in the latest Wonder Woman movie that she is living in France. So it's entirely possible she was in France at the time
that the Kryptonians had invaded the Earth.
Yes.
And tried to destroy it.
And
she just didn't know about it.
I mean, I would assume that they shut down flights international flights at that time.
Yeah, and she doesn't seem to have an invisible jet in this film.
Right, which is a major plot hole.
Yeah, so maybe she's just watching the news and biting her nails.
Yeah, entirely possible. And so I would I'll give them a pass on that. And she was in Metropolis or Gotham for a very good reason, to get back the photograph, which was very important to her. So we can give them a pass on that.
And the photograph, if you haven't seen, I mean, I assume if you're listening, you've probably seen the movie. But the photograph is this photograph of her from sort of World War I era,
right?
That sort of exposes her as not strictly human.
Yes.
Yeah. So okay, so we got that.
Well, I found that the movie sort of had that problem, not exactly of extraneous material, but of just sort of pervasively having these scenes that were it's hard to explain, but like I felt like a lot of the movie seemed disconnected on a scene by scene basis, like one could the connections, the plot, the points between each, what's happening and how the narrative and the stuff developed seemed tenuous, to the point where I had to ask myself, what sort of a narrative is going on here at all. Like I liked I thought the movie was trying to do some very interesting things thematically and with the ideas it was playing around, and with the characters as sort of icons. There are a variety of different Supermans and Batmans in the whole legacy of comics and these figures. And it's the question becomes, what sort of Batman and what sort of Superman is Zack Snyder constructing here, and why? But I felt like in terms of the narrative and the plot, like things were just happening in order that X, Y, and Z can happen, or can be sort of explored or developed in a given scene, and that there wasn't a lot of just in terms of a story that makes sense, that there wasn't a lot of that sort of glue between everything else.
I would agree with that assessment, because you do see this intense preoccupation with getting to powerful visual moments, and there's not a really strong underlying story there. There's this desire to get to these cool, big, flashy moments where someone has this excellent piece of dialogue, or where there's some visual interest or visually interesting thing going on, and how you get there is less important. It suffers from what people in writing circles call idiot plot, where you can suss out a million different things that a character should have done differently, if you're a reasonable person, that they didn't do, because doing it the one slightly more difficult way got you to a more interesting moment cinematically. And I think that's a major problem with the film, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't like it. But overall, I would say it was an enjoyable 3 hours.
Yeah, it's long.
Yeah.
I think my major issue plot wise was with the trope of the mad genius who manipulates everybody's actions, and you're not always completely sure how it's happening. That was kind of my main thing with it, is like, what exactly is going on here in Nairobi, and how is this planned out, and what was the I mean, there's things like that the more you watch it, the more you kind of, okay, I get kind of what's happening here.
And I didn't like the whole Lex Luthor as Mark Zuckerberg thing that he had going on there, where it's I was really hoping that this time around we would get the bald businessman Luthor that you saw in Lex Luthor Man of Steel, for instance, where he's a corporate titan who's a bit more dispassionate.
It's kind of a Nietzsche figure in a way, right? I mean, I think it was an interesting change. I mean, it's not quite. It didn't bother me as much as when they updated Lobo to make him like Edward Cullen.
I haven't seen that
in the comics, but yeah, I mean, I think all these changes are kind of interesting, and I think the one that made a lot of fans mad was the idea that Batman kills.
Yeah.
But I think it makes perfect sense in the plot, and I think too is I'm not pedantically focused on, well, this is this character and this is what he does and yada yada yada. I mean, I look at comics as this way of telling larger than life stories with larger than life characters. Sure. And I think DC in particular has this sort of almost like a feeling like you're reading Greek mythology or something.
Yeah.
And you can get focused on, well, that's not something that Zeus would do or whatever, but at the end of the day, I mean, it's about the stories that you're telling that you can only tell in this kind of format.
Certainly.
And so for me, I mean, it made sense. I mean, in the comics, Batman doesn't kill because he just has this ethic. Mm-hmm. He's not motivated really by it. It's just something he does.
Right.
You're not really sure why he does it. He just does it. But in this film, Batman develops that ethic. And he develops that because of experiences that he has and real life sort of things that happen. And that changes him as a person and gives him a motivation for why he does what he does.
Yeah. That seems like an interesting way to sort of jump in from the assessment of the film as a work of art to the use of it as a vehicle for understanding philosophy and, in your case, theology. Mm-hmm. So did you have some particular interesting points to say about the idea that Batman kills for a particular reason, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the big theme that's here, I would almost bet my every dollar I have in the bank on it that I'm not making this up, because I think that this is very intentional in the film. Is that it's really intending to give an answer to the problem of evil that parallels the Christian answer to the problem of evil. And so the basic kind of theme that I sort of saw here was that, suffering makes us feel bitter and alienated from God and other people, but genuine love and sacrifice can inspire us to look past our momentary pain to see, something a little bit bigger. And so, I think there are places in the film, multiple places, where Superman is compared to God by both Wayne and Luthor. Wayne questions the existence and goodness of God because God let his parents die. In contrast to that, Luthor actually hates God. He doesn't think, I don't know if this guy exists. It's more like a hatred for God because his own father, who he sort of sees as a God figure, that's something that we could talk about too, the idea of the father figure to being parallel to God. But Luthor's father figure, or father, was cruel to him, and he sort of looks at God in that way. I think the line is, what does he say? I have a note here somewhere. Let me see here. No, God takes sides. No man in the sky intervened when I was a boy to deliver me from daddy's fists and abominations. I figured out way back, if God is all powerful, he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, he cannot be all powerful. And then he says at that point to Superman, they need to see the fraud you are with their eyes, the blood on your hands. So really, I mean, everything Luthor is doing in this film, it's not simply, I feel like Luthor in the comics is this very sort of cocky guy, but he's still at the end of the day very insecure. And Superman brings out all of his insecurities. And I don't think that's really the case with this Luthor. I feel like with this Luthor, he hates Superman because he hates God. and that's really what's coming out. And he hates God because he hates his father.
Yeah. So this idea of the problem of evil,
if I may interject, I thought that it was interesting that they chose to approach that through Luthor's sort of, assessment of the problem of evil. And both of these superheroes, Batman and Superman, especially Superman, because when you look at it from the perspective of, if God is, all powerful, then he can't be all good. If he's all good, he can't be all powerful. Then Superman can only sort of approximate that that sort of situation as a flawed icon, because Superman is neither all powerful nor all good. He's very powerful and he's very good, but we've already established the limits of his power, that he can't save everyone, and that moreover that in the previous what was it, Man of Steel? You know, we do see him sort of not even making an attempt to save people, so he's not all good either.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. Definitely sort of where that metaphor breaks down a little bit.
Yeah,
now,
and is and you could ask, is that just another instance of Luther's sort of unhinged insanity, you know, or is it like an actual sort of oversight in the way that they're approaching these themes? I don't know.
I don't know if I'd call it an oversight. I mean, I think certainly at some point or another, all analogies are going to break down.
That's fair.
But, you know, I mean, I think, you know, there is a certain unhinged way that Luther approaches it, but Wayne also sort of makes these same parallels. Or Batman, you know, I think he says, and this kind of brings,
and you might say more cogently.
Yeah, well, for him, he says something. He's talking to Superman. He says, "I bet your parents," when he's fighting him, "I bet your parents taught you that you mean something, that you're here for a reason. My parents taught me a different lesson: dying in the gutter for no reason at all. They taught me the world only makes sense if you force it to." And so, I mean, it's a very different approach. I mean, for Batman, well, God isn't even there. But he's still, but I think that feeds into a little bit his suspicion of Superman, because he's suspicious of the idea of God in general. It doesn't seem right to him. And what he sees on the ground level is that anybody who's ever witnessed who's had power has used it to harm. And so I think he's suspicious of power in that sense. I mean, Luther says something similar. The oldest lie in America is that power can be innocent. Building on this idea of the problem of evil, I did want to just mention that I think that the film does propose an answer to that problem. And it happens through the eyes of Bruce Wayne. What changes his perspective is discovering that Superman is not distant from human pain, but that he is in fact chosen to become human like us, and despite his great power, actually experience true suffering and weakness, the only kind of, it can really only be born out of love. And the allusion, I think, is very clearly here to Christ. God may be powerful, but he's not distant. And we know that because he took on our humanity, because he loved us, and he paid the cost that mortality brings, pain and death. And so, you know, this answered the problem of evil, that, you know, well, you know, you may not always understand what's going on or what God's purposes are in the end, but at the very least, you can't say, well, he's, from a Christian perspective, he's just this distant guy who has no idea what we go through. Because I think the incarnation of Jesus gives a pretty, I think, strong rebuke to that contention. And I think that makes Christianity kind of unique for its answer to the problem of evil, that it's the kind of answer that you wouldn't find in Islam or Judaism, for example.
Yeah. And, you know, just to talk about the problem of evil as a criticism of religion, sort of tearing it away from the context of the film, as someone who is generally quite critical of religion and of the idea of God in general, I've always found the problem of evil argument to be lacking in some important ways in terms of the various kinds of criticisms that atheists like myself can level at religion. And it's lacking, first of all, because Christians have developed quite a good answer to it. It's in fact one of the foundational, it's built into the foundational myths of the Abrahamic faiths, the idea of Adam and Eve and being like fallen from the Garden of Eden and all of that stuff. That's one thing that they really thought through sort of early on, and we can't really criticize them on that grounds. We can criticize them on the grounds that they didn't really see things like evolution coming. They didn't build a lot of other build the correct age of the universe into their mythology, but they did build an answer to the problem of evil into their mythology.
Well, I would approach that somewhat differently, and we're not going to get into a conversation probably about the age of the earth and a discussion about Batman versus Superman, but the problem of evil, I've always heard sort of split up into two different problems. There's the logical problem and the emotional problem. And the logical problem doesn't really get off the ground, because the logical problem asserts that there's absolutely no reason that a good God could have for allowing suffering. And you simply can't prove that. So logically, the logical problem is just nothing. You can't really do anything with it. The emotional problem is different. And that's this idea about, well, why do I suffer? What am I supposed to do with my suffering? Where is God in what I'm going through? And I think that's where Christianity in particular has a unique answer, which is that, God identifies with your suffering in a very unique way that Allah, for example, couldn't.
Yeah. Well, and the other reason why I find this to be a very weak argument is that it requires a degree of pessimism on the part of the person who is making it. It requires the person who is making the argument to portray the world as a place where suffering is common, is ubiquitous, and that we are helpless to do anything about it. And according to my philosophy, suffering is the aberration. It's the result of humans doing things improperly, of organizing ourselves improperly, of accepting incorrect belief systems, and of failing to use our reason to its fullest potential. And
that's definitely, you sound, I was going to say, that's similar to the kind of answer that I hear sometimes more conservative Christians giving the problem of evil. Similar kind of answer. I would give I would feel a little uncomfortable saying it quite like that. But yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of reasons why I think a rational person would disbelieve in the existence of God. But I don't think the problem of evil is one of them.
That is interesting. Well, and you had made a point, Ben, when we were talking kind of before this, about the approaches to thinking about human nature that Superman and Batman seem to kind of instantiate.
Yeah.
And
Superman and Batman represent, in the context of this film and more generally, two different poles on both their ethical viewpoints and on their viewpoints of how society is constructed. Now, we'll start with society and the idea of justice. Superman seems to think that justice is the natural state of affairs, and that society can be protected from injustice by someone around who can smack down the aberrations, who can fight off the alien invasion and rescue the child from the burning building, or pluck the ship that's trapped in ice free. And as long as there's someone around to take care of the few things that go wrong unexpectedly, then everything else will be fine. And those are the kind of problems that Superman deals with both in the film and in the comics. Like, you see him fighting those big extraterrestrial threats in the comics. Batman, on the other hand, he seems to think that that justice is something that must be imposed by force, that left to their own devices, men will just tear each other apart, that we are horrible, nasty, brutish creatures that just need to be whipped into submission. And that does seem to sort of parallel a little bit more what Christians tend to think about humans. That we're fallen, I believe is the word. Ayn Rand said that she thought of man as a heroic figure, and had a very positive view of human nature and human potential. And so in that sense, I think that, and we'll talk about the other sense in a minute, but in that sense, I think that that Superman tends to represent the sort of positive, life-affirming values that are expressed by Ayn Rand and by other sort of humanistic philosophers, from Aristotle down to modern times.
Well, that could be. I mean, at the end of the film, you remember that Bruce Wayne, sort of part of his catharsis is that he thinks that maybe people are basically good. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, well, where did that come from? but that does kind of connect with the parallel that you were making, that he's his way of thinking is changed by Superman.
Yeah.
And, I think in the Christian tradition, you have these, I wouldn't say it's all pessimistic. I mean, I'd say you have two different ideas. One is that man is made in the image of God and reflects God's goodness in some sense. But on the other hand, he also has the capacity for evil and is separated from God in one sense. And so, if God is the source of goodness and we are at a not, we're sort of separated from God, that's going to have an effect on, our passions and our desires and our actions. And, G.K. Chesterton, I think, had written that, it was fashionable in his time, almost 100 years ago now, to doubt the doctrine of original sin or total depravity. And he argued that was the only doctrine in the Bible that you could absolutely prove from experience. And I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think there's definitely, there is in Christian tradition different ways of emphasizing those two, ideas. And I wouldn't say it's completely negative, but I would say that, there is a sense of needing something to come in from outside to change what's happening. And I think that's even sort of suggested in what's happening with Superman. I mean, he is alien in a sense, but he's able to save humanity by becoming one of us.
Well, and I think this idea that you do need something to come in from outside, as you put it, that is essentially what Batman is representing in the viewpoint that he's expressing, that the world only makes sense if you force it to. It was what he said, that justice must be imposed at the tip of a batarang. And Superman, he has the exact polar opposite perspective. And like I said, you can see that by the kinds of threats they both face. Like Superman is rescuing people from the rocket ship that blows up, whereas Batman is beating up and branding the guy that traffics in sex slaves. I tend to sympathize with Superman's point of view in that sense.
Well, I'm going to commit that debate trick where you say, well, there's this one extreme that you represent, and there's this other extreme over here. And I think the right one is right in the middle.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, very good point, Cody. You seem much more reasonable than me when you say it like that.
I do. Well, no, but I do think that it's a synthesis. I mean, I think you can overstate human goodness, and I think humanists do that an awful lot. And I think you can also overstate our wickedness. I mean, and I don't think either are really the right answer. And I'm not saying that as a debate trick. I mean, I think that's the reality. And I say that, I would say that to Christians as well, because I think Christians have done both.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think it's, I don't know.
Yeah. Do you have anything to say on that, Jackson?
We're going to force you to talk, Jackson.
My dad. I'm going to cite my dad here. Is he's fond of saying that is human nature good or evil? Well, it's both. We're made in the image of God. We're good. We do good things, and yet we are fallen. We have a sinful nature and we do bad things. So it really is somewhere in the middle. Just trust my dad.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think we can probably put a flag in that and say that if you hate humans, then you can join the Christian team. And if you think people are nice, you can come be an objectivist. Moving on.
Yeah. So what was your other point about their approaches?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we could start this out with a question, actually. A question I have for you guys with your based on the sort of ethical philosophy that you hold, influenced by Jesus, obviously, and Christian tradition. Can Superman ever take a day off?
I think this came up in the debate that we had, and in some sense,
I don't think we mentioned Superman.
We didn't mention Superman. Well, I don't know that we mentioned Superman exactly, but you'd asked, if we were to acknowledge that, I guess I was sort of saying that it's good to think about others and what's good for them and to sort of want to live your life in such a way that you can make their lives better. And you sort of said, well, if that's the case, then why do you have money and a television, that kind of thing? Well, why not dedicate all of your resources to helping others?
So I don't think that exactly quite frames it right. See, you have to go back to what the central question in ethics is. And the central question in ethics is who benefits from the actions of whom. are you the rightful beneficiary of other people's actions? Like, can you say that the labor of others belongs to you? That's the sort of Viking mentality, this idea of being the predator. And that's the most primal, basic human ethical mentality. And I think what a lot of the early, I won't say primitive, ethical codes that are represented by the Abrahamic faiths and other early philosophers did was they flipped that around, and they created altruism, this idea that other people are the proper beneficiaries of your work, of your actions, and that you owe things to others, whether other, and you can kind of flip it around. Philosophers have throughout the ages and said, you owe things to members of your community, your nation, your race, your religion, your or you owe things to humanity as a whole, or you owe things to the environment, you owe things to nature, you owe things to the nation, the state. Any kind of ethical code that says that you owe others is altruism. That's what altruism means. It's altru-otherism. What egoism says is that every person is the proper beneficiary of their own actions. And these are two fundamentally opposite views in philosophy. This is the strict dividing line that we can separate all ethical codes through. And if you accept some form of altruistic code, no matter who is the end beneficiary of your actions, you have to say at some point that by doing things for yourself when others are not as well off as you are, you're doing something wrong. And that's the point I was trying to make in the debate. It's the point I bring up when I say, can Superman take a day off?
Yeah.
Because in the film, we see lots of scenes where Superman is doing stuff for himself. He's working at at his job to earn some money. He's we see like a really kind of cute scene where he jumps into the bathtub fully clothed with Lois Lane, and they get a little friction.
I think there's some premarital sex happening.
I think that might be the case. Yeah. So there goes your theory about Superman being a Christian.
Yeah, it certainly would.
So much once again for the all good God.
Yeah. But we do see Superman having fun, enjoying himself. At some point, he posed for someone who made a statue of him, apparently. So he's but during that time that he was in the bathtub getting some hanky-panky on with Lois, in a fire somewhere.
Well, that does bring up an interesting point, which is that presumably Superman is able to hear all these things from miles away.
Yeah.
So at any given moment, he's probably aware of something terrible that's happening.
I would assume that I've always thought that he could kind of focus his hearing, that he's not getting just a blitz of all the sound in, so that he can kind of decide when to listen and where to direct that hearing.
Yeah, he does have that power.
Yeah. So,
but he at some point decides he's not going to listen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So while he's getting hanky-panky on with Lois in the bathtub, someone's dying in a fire, and he could be saving them. The question is he wrong not to? Is he wrong to choose the time that he enjoys, the time that makes his life really good, this time he spends with Lois, the woman he loves? Is that something that he's doing that's bad when he could be helping others?
Well, so I would start by saying that you are representing an extreme position, and there's another extreme position on the other side. No, I mean, in a sense, I think that's true. I wouldn't necessarily draw the line between altruism on one side and egoism on the other. I mean, I think that Christianity, the ethic of Christianity, is an ethic of mutuality. I mean, I think it acknowledges the reality that there is no such thing as an individual existing by himself. Even in God's own nature is Trinitarian, which means that even God, the only necessary being that exists, does not exist alone.
So what is your justification for saying that, though? Because I think there's a pretty strong, compelling argument based on scripture
Mhm.
that you do have a very clear altruistic ethic. That
Well, I would say a more mutualistic ethic, I think, is there. The fact that we cannot exist as individuals, so you can't necessarily be individualistic,
Mhm.
period, as you can't go into egoism. But on the other hand, I think altruism has its own downsides. I mean, if you look at, I've just been reading through, the ethical codes in Exodus and Numbers, and what you see there is there's a clear sense of the existence of private property, but at the same time, God says things like, you own your vineyard and nobody's allowed to steal from you, and if they do, they owe you, this much and times whatever.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he also says, leave the corners of your field unharvested so that the poor can come in and take some. And what I think I'm seeing there is not that this belongs to other people because it belongs to other people, which is what altruism would sort of say, or communism or something. But that actually all of this belongs to God, that God exists in mutuality. He has made human beings to exist in mutuality. So you have to balance on some level the reality that you are an individual, that individual persons do exist, but that they also exist within a culture or a communal context or whatever. And so that you can't just pick one over the other. By choosing one over the other, what you've sort of essentially done is you've denied one part of what it means to be human.
Well, so the evidence you seem to be citing for that comes from the Hebrew Bible, which I consider at least to be a completely separate ethical tradition from the one laid down by Jesus.
Sure. Well, would you like me to go to the New Testament?
Well, yeah. So let's see if we can find that, because I can go there.
Yeah.
Let's look at the story of the widow's mite, where we see Jesus analyzes the behavior of two separate people. There's a rich man who comes in and tithes 10% of his vast fortune. And that large amount of money he tithes is going to do a great deal of good for the poor. A blind old poverty-stricken widow comes in. Actually, I don't know if she's blind, but
let's say she's blind because it sounds cooler.
Exactly,
it sounds more severe.
Yeah, and she's only got two little brass. Can I swear on this podcast?
I think it'll be the first time it's happened. I don't necessarily mind it.
Okay,
but I wouldn't go crazy.
She's got two little brass pennies to her name. That's all she owns, and she gives them both away. And he says, "Look at that." I'm actually not going to say what. I'm not going to pretend to quote Jesus directly because I know that would be offensive to some people in your podcast. But Jesus says that the widow is better. She is better because she gave up everything. Those are the only things she had in this whole entire world, and she just destroyed her material existence. And because she did that, because she gave up everything, she's better than the guy who gave up 10% of a vast fortune. Because one is judged not based on the amount of good one does, but rather based on the amount of pain one goes through, the amount of damage one does to oneself.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. I mean, I would say that what's happening there is actually based on a capitalistic system of value, in that, you talk about, what's something worth? Well, it's worth what I'm willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
And on a scale, you could see what it was worth to the rich man, and you could see what it was worth to the poor woman based on what they were willing to give for it.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The woman, because she was willing to give up everything, was better than the man who was willing to give up 10%.
Well, she was more generous. Her motivations were more pure.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's like, I think we're in total agreement. Like, she did more damage to herself.
I don't think the idea is if you are willing to damage yourself a lot, that makes you a better person.
I think that's exactly what the idea is. Like, or if you consider giving up everything that you own, damaging yourself, which I would. I know that from a Christian perspective, you would posit this external post mortal reality where maybe the amount of good she'll get in the afterlife or in the kingdom of heaven would balance out the amount of suffering in the real world. But if we sort of set that to the side and say we're talking about ethics in the material world, then you can clearly see that the widow gave up everything, and was better for it because she did give up all of her joy and all of the possibility that those 2 little brass coins could buy her, in order to receive nothing in return.
What was it to receive nothing? Because let's bring this back to the film, so we're not just having a discussion about it.
So
Superman actually gives up everything.
Oh yeah,
right.
In the end, because he values Lois Lane so much.
So, what you I think are saying is that Christianity says you should give up everything for no good reason, and I don't think that's what Christianity is saying.
Well, I think Christianity is saying you should give up everything in this world.
Yes.
In order to be concerned about the next world.
Sometimes it's the framework.
Now, I think out of the 2 characters, so we're going to take this, look at this in sort of their. Because they both had sort of transformational moments in the final act of the film. But if you look at Superman's actions in sort of the first and second act, compared to Batman's actions in the first and second act, I think Batman more closely mirrors the widow in Jesus' Parallel, because he has given up everything to pursue his war on crime. We don't see. Even though he has an enormous fortune, we don't see Batman ever, or Bruce Wayne ever enjoying it. I think we get a hint at one point. There's maybe like the outline of a feminine shape in his bed as he gets up, and I wasn't quite sure if that was.
Yeah, that was a woman, but he doesn't seem to be super happy about it.
Yeah, like we never see him enjoying himself.
It's like he's just doing it. He's just putting in his time to maintain this Playboy image.
Exactly. Yeah, and so and he has given up everything.
Sure.
And so I would say that Batman and Superman represent quite clear examples of the difference between someone who lives according to an egoistic code, and someone who lives according to an altruistic code. Now, let me give you another example of why.
Well, can I say real quickly? Are you saying that it's your understanding that a Christian is not supposed to have any joy in their life?
Yes.
I would disagree. As I said in the debate, I think is that a Christian is actually called to find joy in something different than he might otherwise find joy in.
Okay. I would accept that. That it's there's supposed to be some like sort of fuzzy outline of joy that you're chasing, and that's the.
Well, it's not just even in the afterlife. I mean, I think
not even in the afterlife.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in Paul's letters,
there's this idea that you can commune with God, and it's the same with in any kind of relationship, or any kind of religion or philosophy. There's like nirvana or enlightenment, or there's some fuzzy thing that you're chasing, that you're giving up the real tangible things in life in order to achieve. But the point is that fuzzy thing on the horizon is a mirage, and you're giving up things that give you real, actual, demonstrable pleasure in order to chase it.
So I would say I was going to talk about different things that Paul had said about joy. Jackson, do you have any thoughts on that since you've been reading through that?
Well,
or anything, just actually anything in response to what Ben's been saying. It's funny that that Ben is holding up Superman as this icon of egoism, because in the end, he does give his life in order to save Lois Lane and the entire planet. It's this act of sacrifice in the end. He's like, well, I am not going to have the pleasure. I am going to die in order to prevent the suffering of others and allow them to go on having their pleasure. That's and as far as what Christianity says about that, I'm inclined to side with you, Cody. That Christianity does not say it's good to suffer, but rather that it says or to put it in terms of the fundamental ethical question that Ben talks about, who is the proper beneficiary of my actions. I'd say that the Christian message is, who is the proper beneficiary of my actions? Well, sometimes me, and sometimes other people, and sometimes both, but like every now and then, as I've been
doing my chocolate book thing and going through these passages, I come across a verse here and there, like the widow's mite story, that that I have to ask, what is it saying here? Like, is it in fact suggesting that, the greatest good is in fact the greatest moral good is in fact the greatest suffering, or are like the other passages that in scripture that talk about good in, terms more along the line of experiencing joy and, having this fulfilled relationship with God. Like, what is, are those passages intended to contextualize these little blips that I see? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there because that's what's on my mind, and just sort of thinking about that in terms of Batman's sort of self-discipline and self-sacrifice in pursuing a particular kind of life, and, Superman's enjoyment of moments in his life and his sort of belief that life is worth fighting for. And then on the flip side, the fact that he actually gives his own life for human life.
Sure. And so just to be clear, and you raise a good point there, but just to be clear, I am not saying that Superman, his final action is or that Superman is entirely an objectivist superhero. But I think if you look at his final action, like the words, his last words to Lois Lane are that "you are my world." And that sort of mirrors to me what John Galt says to Dagny Taggart in a late scene in Atlas Shrugged, where he's on the verge of being taken away to be tortured on this really ridiculous contraption that I never quite understood how it works. That's
because it was made by socialists. Capitalists are always much better at making devices to kill.
Exactly, torture. And John Galt says that he would rather die than give up Dagny Taggart. So it's not that objectivists think that there is nothing worse in the world than death. Clearly, even if John Galt, the sort of prototypical objectivist, is willing to die rather than suffer the loss of the love of his life, I don't think it's
because value is a personal thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Because what?
Value is a personal thing. So
I guess.
Right. So for example, if he's willing to die because of some value that he holds, whether it's his independence or his integrity or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. In this case, it was Dak.
Yeah. Sure. So from your perspective, the value is something personal, right? I mean, it's not necessarily something you can say, this is worth this much, this is worth that much. It's never worth dying. It's never worth suffering.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, every individual, I think what you're getting at there is the concept of the hierarchy of values. And every individual has their own hierarchy of values. And the question is how, it's not to say that there's no objective measure by which we can say, your hierarchy of values is kind of out of whack compared to what's necessary for a flourishing existence as a human being. But yeah, like values are something that individuals hold.
So if Jesus knew that in his suffering and dying, he would raise again to life and that he would save millions of other human beings, and so he felt that was a worthwhile thing to do. It would still be a sacrifice in one sense. It's not a sacrifice the way the objectivists use the word, but it's a sacrifice in the way that most people use the word, which is you do something for a certain goal or a certain purpose or reason. I think objectivists use the word sacrifice like it means like, oh, I just suffered for no good reason. I don't think that's what anybody means.
They typically talk about sacrifice, as if sacrifice were always an end in itself.
Yeah.
So yeah. The way it's the word sacrifice is used in an objectivist context is to attempt to acquire a lesser value, or to attempt to exchange a higher value for a lesser value. So to give up $1 to get 50 cents.
Yeah, and I want to say just really quickly a passage that I thought was kind of relevant to this is in Romans 14. It's verse 17. He says Paul says the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. And he says in the next chapter, verse 13, this is benediction. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. And when I think of this, I mean, this last verse in particular, does that apply more to Superman, or does it apply more to Batman? Batman obviously doesn't have any sense of joy because he isn't abounding in any sense, in any hope. He has no peace in believing because he doesn't believe anything. And so I would say, well, this person is describing, or Paul is better here describing the mentality that Superman has than the mentality that Batman has. And so, they're both doing something, but Batman is attempting to try to, basically the world that Batman lives in is a world that he can't find any joy in. Mm-hmm. Superman is able to find joy regardless of the circumstances. And I think that is the Christian ethic. And I think what the objectivist ethic is saying, well, if you're giving up these real values for these perceived values, well, the problem with these quote unquote real values is that access to them is somewhat limited. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're not able to have material wealth or health or happiness in this sort of, consumeristic kind of sense, you simply cannot have joy.
Yeah. So I think that's actually one of you're sort of touching on one of the sort of areas of objectivism where I have some issue, mm-hmm. and that it's a philosophy that really could only be developed in a flourishing society where most people have access to well-being. Mm-hmm. It's not the kind of philosophy that would give much comfort to someone in a North Korean prison camp. It's not the kind of philosophy that would help someone out when they've found out they have cancer and have 3 months to live. Mm-hmm. There are other philosophies, Stoicism, for example, that might be of more use to someone in that circumstance. And I could almost sympathize with someone who finds religion in if they're in prison or in if they have a terminal illness.
Yeah. I like how you're talking about it like it's like a hetero. I was going to say the example that came to mind. People always talk about when you go to prison and there's no women around, but you're a heterosexual. Well, I can understand if you do it then.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I think of it. Yeah, like this is something for dying and impoverished people.
Yeah.
But you
I appreciate that.
Better.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but I don't find that condescending.
Well, and I just want to go back a couple steps to what you guys were saying about sort of Christians finding joy in life, and I want to point out, like, I think it's totally cool that you guys have stuff that you like enjoy, like that because I don't think that you're people that actively seek out suffering the way your religion tells you should. Mm-hmm. And but I think there is a long tradition of Christians who have done that, of monks who have gone and lived in the most harsh, horrible conditions possible, who eaten rotten food and drank laundry water. And I have a sink in my house where we do our laundry that actually fills up with this cloudy, dark, mushy water that's run off from all of our old, stinky, sweaty clothes. And that stuff is gross. Yeah. And there are a lot of really devout Christians who drink it for.
They do. Yeah, and I'm not going to disagree that happens. I mean, I would say that that's a theological problem in that it comes from this belief that Jesus' sacrifice has not accomplished everything it's supposed to. And so that I now need to suffer a little bit more in order to gain these benefits, because what Jesus has done is not enough to cover everything that it needs to.
Well, and I would say, like, it's actually quite consistent with the sort of underlying ethic of Christianity that it shares with a lot of other religions, and that it shares with things like Buddhism and Hinduism. This idea of the ascetic, the person who attempts to achieve complete material detachment from the world. And it's something that most Christians don't do. Only the most devout engage in that kind of behavior. And I don't think it's bad. I think the world runs on Christian hypocrisy.
Well, so I don't want to keep going too far from the film here, but
Sure.
I will say I think there is a misunderstanding there. I mean, because when I would say that the idea that we are supposed to be separate somehow from our physical existence is a Gnostic idea. I mean, the whole idea of the incarnation is that physical creation is actually good and to be valued. That God was willing to take on humanity, and the Gnostics didn't like that idea because they said, "No, physical matter is awful. We don't want to be involved in that." We're supposed to be, our souls are supposed to depart from our bodies, and then we'll be actually free. And that notion is not Christian. But trying to think of how to tie this back to Batman versus Superman. I think that's almost how Batman. I think Batman is looking at Superman like an objectivist looks at God or looks at Christ, because Batman looks at Superman and he says, "This guy's not one of us. He's in this lofty ascetic whatever. He's not part of us." And then it's when he realizes that Superman, despite being this sort of divine being, he's completely tethered to the human experience. And that's that identification that he's able to see that Superman's grounded. He can empathize with Superman, and it changes his entire outlook.
Yeah, and I would say that and I think I made this point earlier, but that Batman is really living as the perfect Christian. He's giving up all of the stuff that makes life worth living in order to
have sex with models.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Superman is he's out there. He's independent. He's pursuing his own values, his own sense of justice. And I think
Batman's pursuing his own sense of justice.
Well, but I think Superman is explicitly criticized for relying upon his own judgment, and you see this the way the senator talks about him. She says at one point, in a democracy, good is a conversation.
Yeah.
And when she criticizes Superman for acting unilaterally, that reminded me strongly of how the political figures and the other industrialists criticized Hank Rearden in Atlas Shrugged. Hank Rearden invents this powerful new metal that's lighter than aluminum and stronger than steel, and is widely criticized for for having the audacity to come out and disrupt the industry and do all of these and build this new rail line with it and do all of these things without consulting the scientific establishment, without consulting the public. And those are the exact same sort of criticisms that are leveled at Superman in this film.
Well, on the other hand, though, you could take Senator Finch's statement to be trying to domesticate God and trying to say that, this whole idea of this sort of lofty, objective system that you seem to have, that you think you hold, that you think is the right one to hold to. Well, we have to accept that, and you have to run that by us. Yeah. And I mean, you could certainly look at that in the way that atheists will look at morality, Christian morality, or the idea of God in general, and they'd like to domesticate God, and because he doesn't sort of fit in with what they'd like God to be, well, I don't like that. That's no good.
You could do that.
Yeah. you could get just about anything. I just think it's kind of funny how we keep arguing about who is the objectivist and who is the Christian.
Everyone wants to be Superman. Cool. So I think we've beaten that to the death.
I think we
have.
Yeah.
Any other points that we want to discuss?
I have one very important point, and that is part of the story is an adaptation of the Death of Superman story, the arc in the 90s. And I don't understand how you can do a Death of Superman story without Booster Gold.
Oh my God, tell me about it. Yeah, no, without Nathan Fillion playing Booster Gold.
Yeah, because in the comics, it all starts with all these sort of B stringer characters getting the crap beat out of them by Doomsday. Before Superman finally comes and takes his turn.
Well, and if I could take this moment to be extremely self-serving.
Well, that would be consistent, if nothing else.
Booster Gold, for those of you who don't know, is a superhero who has like a strong angle of marketing. Like he wears like corporate logos on his costume, which is quite similar to what my superhero Captain Magnificent does. He's built up a huge merchandising empire.
Just as you will if the book is successful.
What's that?
Just as you will if the book is successful.
Exactly. Yes. In the wake of saving the world, after he saves the world, he cashes in and then uses that money to fund a run for the United States Senate, where he becomes the first Asian American Republican senator, or the first Korean American Republican senator, and the first senator with superpowers. And then from there, goes on a diplomatic delegation to a isolationist communist country called Bhutan, where he gets caught up in a coup.
Ton of coup.
Bhutan.
Yeah.
Gets caught up in a coup and battles the infamous People's Man, the Bhutanese national superhero. So yeah, it's great. And if anyone out there is a literary agent who would like to hear more, feel free to contact me.
It's good. Hearing you describe that, I identified with Alfred's comments. That's how it starts: the fever, the rage, the feeling of powerlessness that turns good men cruel. I completely lost control of this podcast. No, it's actually I have read the book, and especially if you're interested in Ben's philosophy, it's a really fun book because it's a fun book to read, and it also sort of sprinkles in that sort of perspective that he takes, which makes it also a very philosophical read.
Yeah. And it was quite a fun, interesting thing to write because I wrote it sort of at the time as I was transitioning out of this extremely principled philosophical perspective and into one that incorporates a little bit more nuance and pragmatism. And so you see that sort of conflict in there that I was going through with my own philosophy at the time, where where the character is presented with all of these challenges to his own philosophy, and and when he does get a chance to put it into practice, it doesn't really work out as planned.
Now, and so that's not out yet, but if somebody wanted to get a little taste of your style and what you can do, Kung Fu Gladiator is on Amazon, paperback and Kindle. And Jackson's done a lot of cool stuff, but his big thing right now is chocolatebook.net.
Yep. And
do you want to say anything else about the film or about Chocolate Book or anything like that before we go?
Yeah, about the film. This kind of ties into I guess a lot of the areas we covered are an analysis of the film and the assessment of it, as well as the but like I kept finding myself thinking, especially in the early parts of the film as it was setting things up and setting up these themes, that this is asking that same question that you see in Watchmen. Who watches the Watchmen? And the comic book, of course, not the movie. But the comic book, did it much better than I think Batman versus Superman did. But it's the sort of question that one has to ask when faced with these superheroes. Why should we ordinary people, accept the power, like they have the ability to make the world a certain way, and the way that they make the world raises questions like should it be this way? Should you know what I'm saying? It's just that sort of question of even if the power isn't absolute, even if Superman isn't actually all powerful, he's making the world a certain way, and one can ask whether he's using his power responsibly or, whether like Batman is justified in the things that he does.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to raise, and it sort of parallels our conversations about politics and about the whether those people in government who have tremendous power should be doing things the way they're doing, or if they should have less power.
Yeah, again, who is the proper beneficiary of these actions? Mm-hmm. Like, especially when the actions, or inactions result in suffering. Like if, and the question of, and that question wouldn't even be a question if there weren't suffering in the world. Like I guess you might say ethics arises out of the perceived inevitability of suffering. You know, like we ask ethical questions because it seems to us that someone's going to have to suffer, and we have to answer the question, who's it going to be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. So I think I've gotten through everything that I wanted to say. Did you guys have any other things you wanted to talk about on this topic?
I have said literally every idea that I have. No, I'm joking. I don't have anything else intelligent to say. No, I mean, I just want to say I really appreciate you guys doing this. I mean, it's an interesting movie, if nothing else. I understand some of the critiques that you guys had. I think it was more maligned than it should have been. I think it was maligned by critics because they didn't understand comics, and by comic book enthusiasts because they were unwilling to appreciate the art form for what it actually is supposed to be. You know, it's not a perfect film, but I was just blown away that the film was exploring some of these themes, and you got to give it to I think it was David Goyer was one of the writers on this, I believe, and he also wrote the Dark Knight films, and those are pretty cool too, because the Dark Knight also has this kind of a Batman is kind of a Christ figure, where Joker's the devil and Harvey Two-Face is you know, Adam or mankind, because he's sort of corrupted by the influence of Satan or Joker, and then Batman sort of steps in to take the blame so that humanity can be good, or you know, so there's this kind of substitutionary atonement thing, and the Dark Knight Rises has this really kind of cool parallels to the French Revolution, especially A Tale of Two Cities. So I mean, there's all these really, I mean, you know, Goyer at the very least, because he's connected with all these, really brings in some pretty fascinating ideas. And so I was just, if nothing else, I was excited that these ideas were being explored, and I think explored with, you know, with some degree of thoughtfulness and sort of some quality in the filmmaking.
And I think we can all agree it was better than Suicide Squad.
I actually haven't yet seen Suicide Squad.
I will actually never see Suicide Squad.
I never see Suicide Squad.
I wish I had never seen Suicide Squad. Apparently, and I didn't know this, but superpowers are derived from ethnic stereotypes.
I've always maintained that. Yes.
Yeah. At least in Suicide Squad.
All right. Cool.
Hey, thank you so much for having inviting me on, Cody. It was a really awesome experience getting to talk about comic book movies with you guys and the philosophical implications. I didn't think there were that many people out there that were into this stuff as well as me. But
well, judging by the volume of listeners that I've had, there aren't that many. Yeah. But we'll see what happens with that. Thank you guys, everyone, for listening, and thank you, Jackson and Ben. I've mentioned chocolatebook.net. I've also mentioned Ben. Ben's last name is Doublett, so if you're looking him up on Amazon, Ben is pretty much how it sounds, and Doublett is Doublettt.
Yep, like the word double with two T's at the end.
Yeah, because you got to double the T's. All right, cool. Well, thank you guys so much.